The craziest interview ever came out from the actual former CEO of Activision Blizzard that spilled the beans that confirmed everything we previously believed on why WoW started going downhill after Legion. Turns out, Blizzard was actually building a new project to replace WoW, which explains why the game felt like it was on a back burner, but that project was abandoned. That is how Overwatch was created, from the ashes of the Titan project. Then, Chris Metzen came to a disagreement over the movie, which the CEO personally says was the worst movie he ever saw, and Chris Metzen hated the two expansions they planned at the time after Legion, BFA and Shadowlands, and this is why he really left. He knew this would not do good, he knew these expansions wouldn't perform well. However, now that he's returned, it completely explains why Blizzard is literally like half-soft retconning all this stuff that happened after Legion. It looks like this World Tour Saga is what was originally supposed to happen after Legion, so the natural follow-up. So let's take a look at this interview, as so far this is the juiciest behind the scenes yet. While having the best deals on the market for all games and software, Gamivo just added mobile top-ups for your favorite mobile games with the best prices that you can get with my Gamivo link in the description below. Best of all, if you use my code DORON, your discount will be even bigger, so make sure to use my link in the description and the code and check out Gamivo. So a really interesting interview came out recently from the former CEO of Activision Blizzard, Bobby Kotick, who was essentially considered and still is, like the equivalent of Galliwix IRL. However, despite this interview being sort of him, washing his hands of a lot of things he did, there are some really interesting nuggets that totally explain what was really going on behind the scenes, other than just his own perspective. We as players that have followed the game for ages have definitely noticed this, but it really explains the sharp decline that happened a few years back and why it really does feel like WoW is now sort of getting back on its feet after all this time. As I said, Bobby Kotick offers more insider information into Blizzard and what really happened because, as you may remember, WoW was crazy popular. It was one of the most mainstream games out there. Then Warlords of Draenor came, it was kind of a mess, which was really the first ever real decline of the MMORPG, but then they bounced back immediately with Legion, and then after that it was just downhill, downhill and downhill with one L after the other, and only now is WoW starting to recover and get its reputation back. Especially the old school players can remember how pristine Blizzard's reputation was over a decade ago. They were known for quality, for being an awesome company, and how it literally turned 180 degrees a few years later. So there were two problems that sort of were killing WoW that we speculated, but now he actually confirms it. So the initial big problem was the Warcraft film. Bobby Kotick says it was a terrible idea, and it was actually a major factor why Chris Metzen decided to leave the franchise. The Warcraft movie was apparently signed ages ago, even before the actual Activision merger, but it turned out to be a huge diversion for the actual game studio, the guys that were actually building the game. Despite the fact that a movie team was building it, a huge part of the actual game team participated in the movie, and it took a lot of their resources. They were on the set all the time. It was a huge distraction for actually building WoW. The expansions were late. It took nearly 2-3 years to get a new expansion. It took forever to get the patches on time. Things were constantly late. They never hit the schedule that was initially plotted out. Now, despite the fact that the Warcraft movie did end up breaking even with the Chinese market, Bobby Kotick says the movie was so bad, it was one of the worst movies he had ever seen. Now, personally, I don't think it was that bad, but I can see the perspective where it distracted from the actual game. Something happened that he doesn't say. I'm guessing Chris Metzen might have wanted more autonomy on the movie here, but this was apparently a major factor why he decided to leave Blizzard. Another factor was that they had planned 2 future expansions sort of without him, and he hated the ideas and he sort of just said screw it and left, despite the CEO literally begging him to come back. Another failure that was going on at the time, and you may remember the sort of WoW killer meme that was going on back in the day, like what game would kill WoW, and a lot of people said Blizzard would make their own WoW killer. Turns out they really were planning to do that with the Project Titan that was always kept hidden, and that ended up being a whole sink just for money and a massive disaster. They spent a crazy amount of money on the Titan, and it was this big, ambitious, how to actually replace World of Warcraft as the main game, and all this money and development time could have really been spent on making WoW better, getting more patches, more content, or even an extra expansion. It ended up not even being playable, so they decided to scrap the concepts and repurpose them, and this is how they actually created Overwatch. So initially, there was supposed to be this new WoW 2 that was completely different, a completely different story with the Overwatch aesthetics, but then they turned into a completely different game. However, what I find really interesting is that this explains so much that has been going on. Around 2016, when Chris Metzen left, they had already planned out BFA and Shadowlands, and turns out Chris Metzen literally hated these two expansions. He said outright that these are not good ideas, that they need to be redone. He would come back if they can drastically change it. This has two really interesting points. Based on the expansion reception, I mean, Chris Metzen really was right, because BFA and Shadowlands definitely didn't do well. They were absolutely terrible in terms of performance compared to the past expansions. But what I think is even more interesting is that apparently it appears they planned the entire Jailer Shadowlands idea all the way back in Legion. Chris Metzen obviously had the World Soul Saga thing in mind, which is why he directed the entire Sword of Sargeras thing at the end of Legion, and this kind of explains the crazy dissonance that we've noticed over the years that happened after Legion. I mean, we went from one storyline of this sword being stuck to literally ignoring it for years, then doing something completely different. I've personally been talking about this for years and years, about how there just isn't consistency, how so many stories start and nothing happens, and we're jumping from this to that. It looks like the theory that people had that Chris Metzen is planning to ignore everything post-Legion and start anew with the World Soul Saga was sort of right. I'm not sure if originally Chris Metzen had the World Soul Saga thing in mind, like as an actual saga, like a 3 expansion saga. Personally, I think they started from the other games and they decided to want to do it for WoW as well, and they already went along with it before Chris Metzen returned, so now they're going with it. But I think these midnight ideas and the last Titans is definitely something that Chris Metzen had probably planned back in the day, at least to some extent. It makes sense when you think about it. If you may remember the massive shattering of Azeroth when this sword attack happened, then Blizzard started telling us, look at that star, this is the prison of Sargeras, we should be worried if it disappears. However, after that we just went with some crazy faction war where Sylvanas worked for some random jailer guy that they literally just made up. It is now so obvious that this was such a random and really botched process, by definition botched, that didn't involve long-term planning. I mean, they literally only thought of this jailer as a figure, but they had no idea what to actually do with him, which is exactly why he looks so different in that original cinematic behind Sylvanas, and that figure had absolutely nothing to do with Zowal when we actually saw him, or anything else that happened later. It also explains the countless plot holes that was really the disaster of the lore of the Shadowlands. So despite Kotick obviously not being a good thing for the game, I mean, let's be real, I mean, no one is saying Kotick did nothing wrong, I do think he did reveal some interesting behind the scenes on why things turned out as they did. I mean, first, the movie was a massive distraction that caused Chris Metzen to leave and also took away from the production time for the actual game. Then they worked simultaneously on WoW and this Titan project. Blizzard literally planned to replace WoW with this game, so that might explain some things. As Kotick said, instead of working on WoW, they were doing this replacement thing, which might explain that they literally had like a death timer on WoW and they were thinking of wrapping this up, which turns out it was a bad idea, and then just Overwatch came out of this. Then after this, they planned out the future of WoW without Chris Metzen, or with very minor insight from him, and then the awful storyline of BFA, which really, when you look at it from this perspective, was just a prelude to the Shadowlands. And Chris Metzen, when he saw this concept, literally said, I hate this won't do good. However, after that, Blizzard just spiraled into madness with way too much employee bloat, and they were starting new projects that led nowhere, and WoW had that insanely massive drought back in the Shadowlands that you may remember. However, to not be a doomer here, I mean, the good news is that this is really a thing of the past, as it seems. Since Activision Blizzard was sold, they added new teams that put all their focus on World of Warcraft. Chris Metzen returned, he's picking up the story from Legion and sort of half soft retconning and pretending BFA and Shadowlands never happened, and now their patch cadence is actually crazy. I mean, the War Within was just released, we're getting a new expansion announcement this summer with new patches coming out every few months, which literally never happened in WoW's history. Personally, I think War Within was already made by the same team that built Dragonflight, so this is just a warm-up and still remnant of some of these botched storylines, but I do think Midnight and The Last Titan are going to be fully Chris Metzen expansions, and really the storyline that we should have gotten from Legion, which actually might bring back WoW to its former glory, despite how old this game actually is. Thanks for watching. Check out my video on Android being the king again by clicking on the screen, and check out my main channel by clicking on the screen as well. See you next time.